Hello, everyone, and welcome to this webinar today. I'm Francis Seeley from GlobalNet 21, and this is one of the regular webinars we do on most Tuesdays. And we cover a wide range of subjects. We usually get a speaker who makes a presentation, and then we invite you to ask questions and make comments. And Fong, who you can see here with us at the top, will help me put those questions to the speaker. Now, in the many topics that we deal with, one of those that we've dealt with in three or four webinars has been conflict resolution. We've looked at how we can create cohesive communities and avoid conflict through sports and entertainment. We've looked at how we could do that through social enterprise by people working in the community with their social enterprises. We've looked at how you can create creative conversations to bring people with widely different views together and to try and resolve those conflicts by thinking and behaving in a different way. But today we've got one of the most remarkable stories of all. We've got the story of a person, Joe Berry, who you see very soon, who's been through a traumatic experience. Her father, Anthony Berry, was an MP in the North London constituency, my constituency, in fact. And he was an MP for many years. And tragically, he died in the Brighton bombing, which took place at the Conservative Party conference in the early 1980s. And that murder really traumatized Jo, and she felt the necessity of finding out why it had to happen. Why did they do it? What was behind it? She wanted to understand it. So she went in search of the person who actually laid the bomb, the person who was the killer. And when the Good Friday Agreement took place, he had been in prison and he was released, and Jo went in search of him. And I think they had a meeting, which was, I think Jo told me, if I remember rightly, a 4-hour, very intense meeting. And a result of that and other meetings, they came to an understanding, and they actually became friends. And they started working together for peace and reconciliation, which they've been doing ever since. Now that is a remarkable story. Anyhow, I'm going to hand you over to Jo now to tell you her story. And please remember, listen, but please type in questions, comments as you go along, because I'd love to put those to Jo when she's finished her presentation. So thank you, Jo, for coming on today. I know you've told the story many times, but you haven't done it on a webinar yet. So in a way, this is a new experience, the first time for you. So I'm going to hand over to you, and please tell us your very interesting and important story.
Thank you. What an amazing introduction, and it's a privilege to be with you all today. And I am passionate about how we resolve conflict, and I'm going to share a little of my story and where I am now with the conflict that we face today. So back in 1984, as you heard, my father was killed in the Brighton bomb. He was a Tory MP who was attending the Conservative Party conference, and there were 5 people killed. And it was the IRA who said they were responsible within probably 24 hours. And for me, it wasn't just losing my dad that was difficult, and that was extremely difficult, but it was also how he was killed. That was really important for me. And I felt that I was then part of a war, part of a violent conflict, and I couldn't go back to the person I had been, which was a bit of a free spirit of no responsibilities. So within 2 days, on the Sunday, he was killed on the Friday, I went somewhere in London, which means a lot to me, St. James's Church, and made a very silent, quiet, private commitment to understand those who'd killed my dad and to bring something positive out of it. I never wanted an enemy, but that day I did have an enemy. So I saw it as a journey of changing from having an enemy to having someone with a human face. And I knew it was about giving up blame. I knew it was about feeling what I was feeling, but not actually blaming anyone else. And it was a journey that I didn't know how to go on, but I trusted that life was going to somehow bring me the experiences. And within a couple of months, I had a profound experience that shaped the next few decades. And that was, I ended up sharing a taxi with a random stranger in London. We were both trying to get to the same place. There weren't enough taxis around. And I could tell that he was from Northern Ireland. So I said to him, I'm on this journey. I really want to understand why someone would join the IRA. Do you know anything about this? My father's just been killed by the IRA, which is an odd way to start a conversation, but that's just how I was in those days. And he said, actually, my brother, he was in the IRA, and my brother was killed a year ago by a British soldier. So there we were, we should have been enemies. We came from different sides. We both had our pain, and yet we both chose to not go for revenge. We both chose to look at a world where peace was possible and there weren't any enemies. And I remember leaving that taxi thinking, this is one way I can make a difference. I can build a bridge across the divide. And so that stayed with me, and I travelled to Belfast in 85 and 86 and met people who shared their stories of what it was like to live with the British Army on the streets. I shared my story at different places. I met people who were creating safe houses. At that time, it was quite a dangerous time for me to even be in parts of Belfast, but my need was so great to meet people that I actually didn't mind. And I wrote down my thoughts, and that got photocopied, and I started getting letters from people in prison, part of the INLA, which is a breakaway group of the IRA. I met someone whose brothers were in the IRA. I met someone high up in Sinn Féin, and it was all about humanizing the other. But I hadn't done any of the emotional work of actually dealing with the trauma. And so I reached a point where I knew I couldn't go anymore. And it was only in the peace process that my life changed in a big, big way. Part of the peace process was an agreement that all the political prisoners would be released from prison. And there was one person held responsible for the Brighton bomb, Patrick McGee. And he was released in June 99. And the first I knew of it was, I remember watching the BBC News, and it was the headlines: Patrick McGee released from prison, and the world's press were there. And I remember thinking quite angry, it's all right for him, he's free, but my dad could never come back. But then thinking, this is for peace. This means less people are going to be killed, so I welcome it. And I knew then there was time for me to look at my own healing and some of the emotions that I had suppressed and needed really to be listened to. And so I went somewhere in Ireland, and for the first time I got emotional support. And the year 2000 was an extraordinary transformative time. And during the year, I met people who knew Patrick McGee. It's quite a small world over there. And 3 times people said they could arrange for my meeting to happen. I think I'd wanted to meet him since he'd been arrested. And it was to have that meeting just to see him as a human being. And so I tried 3 times to have that meeting, and each time I was told, no, he doesn't want to meet you. And sort of feeling disappointed, and then trusting that if it was right, it was going to happen. And then a 4th time I met someone who said, I can arrange this meeting. And I said, please go ahead. And within a few weeks, I got a phone call to say that he was going to be in a house in Dublin. And I remember the day so well. I was planning to go from Holyhead to Dublin on the ferry to go to a residential workshop. And I wasn't feeling that inspired or visionary. I was just feeling quite sort of mundane and wondering whether I even wanted to meet him that day. But then I thought, what would it feel like for this to be okay? This is so huge. And I was on the ferry on my own with no support, really overwhelmed at the enormity of what I was about to do. And I remember thinking, it could be harder for him. I've spent all these years really finding out about him and learning, and I am as prepared as I can be. What does he know about me? And there I am in my friend's house, and there's a knock on the door, and in he walks, and I got up and shook his hand, and he spoke quite quietly and said, no, thank you for inviting me. And I said, I really appreciate you changing your mind and agreeing to meet me. And he said, "Oh, I've heard a few times that a daughter of one of my victims has wanted to meet me, and I've always said yes." So we started wondering how his yeses got translated into no's, and that sort of broke the ice. And we went into our own room, and that first meeting was 3 hours, and it was so intense. I remember looking at him into his eyes and thinking, you've killed my father, but you just look so normal. How can this be? Another part of me going, what are you doing sitting here with the guy who killed your dad? You've gone mad. But more of me wanted to be present to him, wanted to really listen. And I was curious, who was he beneath the rhetoric I was hearing, beneath the political justification? And I listened and I asked questions, and I was really interested in who he really was. And he started off by sharing some of the political reasons why, for him, the Brighton bomb had been a good strategy, and how it had worked, and how now he'd got what he wanted. He had a political platform. And I remember thinking, after about maybe an hour and a half, I've really got what I want. I've seen him now as a human being. I've looked into his eyes and seen compassion there and sensitivity. And he's no longer an enemy. I've seen beyond that. But he is justifying killing my father, and that is difficult. And I sort of thought I'd reached my limit of hearing that. So I was about to end it, knowing that my need had been met, when he stopped talking, and he took off his glasses, and he rubbed his eye, and he said, "I don't know anymore who I am. Can I hear your anger and your rage, and what can I do for you? I've never met anybody with so much dignity." And in that moment, I knew that he'd taken off the political hat, and he'd opened up and become vulnerable. And what had just been my need now became his need. And the conversation was very different after that. We had another hour and a half of him sharing his personal experience of what he went through, moving from believing in non-violence at 14, believing in Martin Luther King, to 18, choosing violence. And he wanted to know the kind of man my dad was. And for the first time, he was seeing him as a human being. Because when he planted that bomb, he saw no human beings. And he began to realize that he was guilty of demonizing the other in the same way he'd always said the other was guilty of demonizing them, and that he'd lost some of his humanity through choosing violence. And after about this extra hour and a half, I'd reached my limit completely of being able to listen to him, and I'd got more than I'd hoped for. I realized that we were on a journey together, and so I thanked him, and I said that I needed to end it. And he said, "I am really sorry that I killed your dad." And that was him acknowledging that he had been beginning to realize he'd killed a wonderful human being. And after that meeting, I was on a high for a bit, and then felt very disorientated, like I'd met my enemy and I'd seen some of his humanity. And there was no support around. There was nowhere I could go at that time. And it was hard. I just wanted to go back for the next conversation, and that was 3 weeks later. And someone filmed some of that purely for a reconciliation project, never to go public. For me, this was a very personal response, something I need to do for me. I was really clear about that. It was about my healing. It wasn't about something for the world. And I didn't meet Patrick to change him, it was to change myself. And that is still true. I'm still changing myself. And along the filming time, we got to speak together over the next year. Hours and hours we spent, and he shared so much with me. And I remember reaching a place inside me that wondered, if I'd lived his life, would I have made the same choices? And I don't know. And in that moment, it's not about forgiveness. There is nothing to forgive. It's about empathy. It's about understanding. It's beyond judgment. Now, I'm not always in that space, but I can reach that space. And I've had that experience with men and women who represent all sides in Northern Ireland, and also with people who were there, loyal to non-violence. And it's made me really see that if I listen to people's stories, if I open my heart and listen, then I can empathize with everyone. And there, at that moment, there is no other. There are no sides. There's just all of us grappling with our own experiences. And I do feel it's a shared responsibility that his community felt they had, those in his community who chose violence, that felt they had no choice but to use violence. And the first time we spoke in public, Patrick said he now knows he could sit down and he could have had a cup of tea with my dad. You know, such a simple thing to say. But there's a lot in that, because yes, I can imagine the two of them together, and that is a healing metaphor. It's a healing image. But the Conservative Party didn't have a policy of cups of tea with their enemies, and they still don't. You know, and yet actually a lot of the violence could have been prevented through dialogue, through facilitated conflict transformation groups, through all sorts of restorative processes. It could have been. It's not that him and the other men and women I met in the IRA couldn't have been listened to and acknowledged and talked to. And I feel that applies to all situations that we have now. But as soon as we demonize people and make them less than human, then violence is bound to come on the agenda. So I'll just end by saying, so since then we have become friends. It's a challenging friendship. It's unusual. It's not maybe a normal friendship. Last time I spoke with him, he said that was in Switzerland, and he said that he almost trusts me more than anyone else because of what we've been through together. And we've spoken in different places where he's the only person that I know, and so we give each other support. And it's always, every time I speak with him, it's always different. I'm still learning about myself and my own response. So it's a transformational friendship. And it's one where actually I really acknowledge his courage in engaging with me, because in some ways it gets harder for him. And I think back to the me aged 27 that wanted to bring something positive out of what had happened. And actually what has happened is the most extraordinary way of creating something positive, and I could never have dreamt that so much was possible. So I'll stop there.
Okay, thanks very much, Joe. That was a really, really important story. I was going to say interesting, but that's not the right word. It was a very important story of how people can create empathy and understand where other people are coming from. And then when you are, as Veronica, who's with us today, says, when you put yourself in someone else's shoes, then the world suddenly becomes a different place. And you went through that experience. When you went through that experience, Joe, I mean, at what point, well, first of all, I mean, did people understand it? I mean, your family, other people. I mean, there are lots of people who couldn't have done what you did. Maybe they could have, but they would have needed a lot more help. So did you get support from people outside, or did you find there was lack of understanding about what you were doing?
Yes, well, so the first year, my family didn't know, and we actually got support from the people who were making the film. And it was important that we didn't tell anybody. It was all done confidentially, because there were a lot of people to prepare on his side as well as my side. So that first year was very, very hard. You know, and I mean, recently I've trained as a restorative justice facilitator, and we literally broke every rule. It's really how not to do it. But then I think back in 2000 with the peace process, it was so early on, it probably couldn't have happened any other way. And then once it went public, I did obviously prepare all my family, and I wrote to all the other families in Brighton who weren't too happy about it. And I really had to think hard, was this going to further the peace process? Was it going to be part of the fragile peace in Northern Ireland, or was I going to set everything back? And it was a hard choice to make at that time. And then once the documentary came out in 2001, then I met people who did give me support, who really understood it, that it was about breaking the cycle of violence and revenge, and almost helped me get the words to describe this intense experience that I was having.
So, I mean, how did you find the strength at the beginning to go through this on your own? I mean, it was a lonely journey. I mean, you went through trauma, you were on your own, you had your own thoughts, you had your own doubts, you had your own pain, and in a way, you couldn't talk about it because you were going through this journey as well. It was very difficult. So, where did you find the strength to carry on?
Well, I don't know. I think it was just the amount of the level of the depth of hurt that I had, and opening my heart to the war, that it was almost survival. I had to transform that pain into some action, and it was a sort of almost something internal that happened, that when I felt the pain and then started doing something, I started feeling a lot better. So it was almost like my own therapy. And I was absolutely sort of stubbornly insistent that I was going to go on this journey. And there's a long story of some of the dark alleys I visited along the way, but that year 2000, I was just determined. And it was healing for me. I was getting more trust in myself and learning things, and it was also a very transformational time, as well as being really scary. But it made sense of everything, that I kind of I had to do it in a way.
So, do you feel that you're a sort of changed person now? I mean, I ought to tell a story. I told this at the meeting we had ages ago, and I will tell it. I don't know if I should, but in
Yeah,
1974 February, I actually stood as a parliamentary candidate against Joe's father. And at that time, Jo, I think, was delivering leaflets for her father when I was the Labour candidate at that time. And I was a very brash and adversarial young candidate at that time, and I've meddled a lot since then. But so I thought this man was the enemy, and so I didn't really engage with him in the way I did, and I've regretted that ever since. I felt a lot of remorse, actually, that I was like that, and that when I heard of Joe's story, it helped me to think of myself and changing as well. But Jo, I mean, you went through much more dramatic story than I did. So, do you think that you come out of this a very different person, not the person who was delivering leaflets on the doorstep, who went to parties, who sort of enjoyed the 1960s revolution, but someone who is a different person totally now?
Wow, I'd forgotten all that story. What year was it that you stood? 79.
It was it was February 1974. There were two elections in that year, February and then October,
Oh, yeah.
and I stood in the one in February.
Yes, well, I was already rebelling, so I was not delivering leaflets. So, and I was 10 when I delivered leaflets, so yes, I probably wouldn't have even been there that year. I was being a hippie, and definitely rebelling against politics. So yes, has it changed me? Well, it's really interesting because I remember as a teenager writing poems anti-war, and if you'd asked me what I wanted to do, I would have said I just want to stop war. But unfortunately, there wasn't a career, so I didn't tell anyone. And then it wasn't a career, but that's in my heart of hearts. I remember Vietnam, and it was such a terrible time as a teenager of just feeling that pain. So in some ways, my love for non-violence and my empathy's been there all my life. But what has really changed is, I would say, my emotional intelligence. I literally had 1% emotional intelligence the day the bomb went off. I just used to meditate. I didn't know what to do with feelings. It's very uncomfortable, and I had no idea what to do with that kind of pain. And I'm now very comfortable with my emotions. And yeah, sometimes I still hurt and want to blame people, and I can get angry, but I'm getting better at changing that response. But I'm not sitting here thinking I'm sorted. When things happen and I feel hurt, I still got a part of me that goes, I want to blame someone. But it's about catching that response and then choosing another one. So that self-awareness has grown, and I'm more aware when I hurt people and when I hurt myself as well. And I'm more comfortable with other people's emotions, my own emotions, and I understand the value of feelings. So that's changed a lot. And also I think my self-esteem has grown, and my trust in myself, because actually I lost trust in myself. That was one of the appalling legacies of the bomb, that about 4 months afterwards I completely lost trust in myself, and that definitely delayed the healing journey. And then I think just my understanding of the roots of violence, and you know, I I think I'm a much less judgmental person, and I love the people I meet, the opportunities that I have to make a difference. My life is really rich in terms of relationships of extraordinary people that I know from around the world who are doing amazing work. And I'm sure many people here also know these people who've had really huge adversity and are doing positive things, and that's what gives me hope, that I'm not on my own now. There's a whole network of amazing people around the world, of which I'm humbled to be part of.
Okay, I mean, fun, come in whenever you want. But I mean, the other interesting thing is you can come from quite a sort of large family, don't you? And you had a sort of really sort of big family environment. And I think were you the youngest, I think, of the family? I mean, did that sort of make you feel that you had to sort of find your own way? Is that what made you the rebel? Is that what, started you on the path of thinking differently that's led you to where you are now?
Well, I'm sort of in the middle. My dad had 6 children, uh, and but 2 different wives. My mum divorced him when I was about 6. So I'm sort of in the middle, and I don't know. Like, it's really interesting how in families, people respond in different ways, and everyone has their unique way of experiencing and needing to heal. And there's one other member of my one sibling who also wanted to understand why it happened, but the others, it was more about mourning the loss of a wonderful father. So I don't really know what it was in me as a child that I was just wanting to know why people did things, at a very early age, and obviously that's still there, really strong. And I even remember asking my dad, sort of what it meant for him to be in politics, and we had the most extraordinary conversation. And I actually, we were always very close, but I built a very powerful bridge with him, where he understood me and my unusual life, and I really understood him.
I think you once, I think at the meeting we had, said that you're talking about your dad and the way you are now, but I think you also said that, you got to your dad and looking at things differently. He began to look at things differently in the Middle East, for example. He began to empathize, he began to understand, and you helped him on that journey, which as a politician is very difficult sometimes, because politicians have strong egos and they find it very difficult to change their mind. And having a daughter like you must have helped him a great deal. And I remember you saying that he was beginning to change and you helped him on that journey. Do you remember saying that?
I certainly helped him change with his perception of me, but he was one of these MPs who was very much a people's person. And I mean, I remember going to Enfield, and he spent all his time listening to people. Like, he wasn't ambitious. He really did care about people, and he was always interested in people who are different to him and wanting to support people. So he was innately, I think, a very accepting person and not so motivated by career.
I am working with people from prisons, and it is very difficult to convince other people to help them, to give them jobs. Can you draw any parallel between your situation and the people who are resenting people from prison? How to help them to build a bridge and to try to see it from another angle?
Well, prisoners are very demonized in our society. I spend a lot of time in prisons, and I know how completely unfair and inappropriate it is. And I think the way to change people who demonize the other is through sharing stories, is to bringing a personal story. And then I've seen the most extraordinary transformations happen with someone who saw someone as an enemy and less than human, and then they listened to their story, and then they made the connections, and then they began to empathize. But how do we bring the stories of prisoners to those that demonize them? I mean, that's a huge job.
So you said that you have met a lot of people from prisons. May I ask what kind of crime that have they committed? Are they political, or was it just normal
Yeah, all sorts
crime?
of
All sorts.
crime. Yeah, I've worked a lot in prison with the Forgiveness Project, who have a project called Restore. I now am working as a restorative facilitator, and I'm actually working on a homicide case now. I've given talks in prisons, women's prisons, men's prisons, on my own with Patrick, and actually it hasn't even been appropriate to ask what everyone is there for, but I certainly have heard so many of their stories and know that they need the support when they leave. So the work that you're doing, I'd love to know more, is really, really needed and important.
How do you connect the people from the outside and the people from the inside?
Well, that's a big question, and I don't know how, other than bringing people together so they can meet and hear each other's stories. I think face-to-face encounters is sort of the only way, really.
Because what I see is that there is a big problem. There are a lot of people in prison, and there are not enough space. So it's just practical. And when they come out, if I don't get a job, they will go and commit a crime, and they get in again.
Yeah.
So the population would keep increasing, and if we don't help them, is one thing. The other thing is that it would make it much more difficult for them, because it's like a circle. They are going around the circle. They would never get out of it. The longer they are in the circle, the worse it's going to be for themselves and for ourselves.
But I mean, that's an interesting point. I mean, you met Joe, you met Patrick. You must have met other people who were in the IRA as well.
Yeah.
And they were in this circle. They were in this cycle themselves. I mean, did you get to know other people in the IRA? Did you find ways of breaking that cycle for them as you broke that cycle for yourself? Was there a process you went through in that?
Yeah, I have some friends who were in the IRA, and before I met Patrick, I met other men who were in the IRA. Actually, that was really important preparation, and so yeah, I mean, now so when I go to Belfast, I'll make sure that I see some of them, and I mean, for a lot of them, their lives have changed, and they are back doing normal work in the community. There still is, as you know, in Belfast, some difficulties there, but they are sort of quite well back integrated into the community. I understand with normal criminals, normal, because that's the political prisoners called them like the normal prisoners, because they very much like to have that difference. But I know that can be, I know it's an impossible situation, and I think our whole justice system needs to be changed. You know, it's just based, I think, on revenge, rather than any kind of restoration, and sort of actually looking at the root of what's going on and trying to address that.
Linda Powell says that she's got Mike Freeman with her. I don't know if you know Mike Freeman, who spent time in prison, and he knew some of the bombers there, and he's written his biography about that. And so she said she found the story, your story, very intriguing, very interesting, very important. And she was talking about the importance of prison as being almost a radicalization environment. It's not a place where people sort of reform or rehabilitate or even get punished. It becomes a university for carrying on doing other things. And did you find that in your journeys was happening in prison was a part of the problem in terms of radicalization?
Well, Patrick's experience is that he stayed as part of the IRA until he was released. So he was in England for some of the time, but when he went back to Northern Ireland, he was with other IRA prisoners. I mean, he wouldn't use the word radicalization, because he sees it very much as a political cause. And when he was in prison, he did meet some lawless prisoners, and I know that was a very important part for him. And the last few years he was in prison, he knew that the peace process was beginning to happen, and that he was preparing himself for the kind of work that would be. He didn't think he'd meet victims, but he thought he would be meeting ex-British soldiers, ex-lawless paramilitary, and that would be part of addressing the hurt that the IRA had done.
So when you met him and you befriended him and you talked for hours and hours, when did the point come where you said, well, look, we can make a difference, we can work together, we can do something to heal other people's wounds as well? When did you start trying to make that difference?
I don't think we ever thought about making a difference like that until we realized we were. In the beginning, it was just about our need to be together and to share. And then we sort of started noticing that other people were getting something out of it. But so it's really hard to know when we were both like really aware of it. We were sharing in public. It was because that was the easiest way for us to have the conversation.
But how did that sharing in public start? Because it's a big step from moving from talking to someone as a healing process for yourself and talking about it in front of an audience. Then you go public, then it becomes something different.
Yeah, it was. I think the first sort of public thing we did was after the documentary went out, and it was Scylla Elworthy, so I'm sure you know her amazing piecework. She invited us to speak at an event in London, and we only had a few minutes each. And I remember how terrified I was, and I think at that moment, I think after the documentary went out, I had realised that it could help others. So it was beginning to change for me then.
So what have you done now? I mean, you've developed your sort of initiative of getting peace and reconciliation. You have your own website, don't you, now? And this has become the mission of your life.
Yeah, so like originally, I would say that my heart was holding these islands, the healing of those, but now it has moved to the world. And I don't really believe in closure. I don't really want closure, because when people are suffering, and we know they are, I want to be able to care and to do what I can. So I do work locally, and then also nationally, and then in Europe, and then also around the world. And I respond to invitations, and then also create my own projects. Patrick isn't speaking with me as much as he has done, though we've just done quite a few actually recently, and we just come back from Switzerland, and we did a couple in Ireland. But he's taking time off to write and finish his book. and that's fine. But if I said to him that I've got the funding for us to go to Colombia, which we're working on, he would be totally like, I'm coming. But then I also do a lot on my own. I'm working with Muslim women. Muslim women at the moment are really demonized, and I don't think that there's enough support for that community. And I want to build bridges. I want to bring groups together from the far right. I think we need to listen to them. We need to listen to the people who are out on the streets and saying that. I mean, some of the I don't even want to repeat them. Some of the dreadful things we've heard, like they need to be listened to as well. We need to listen to every part of the community, and I think what's going on right now in the UK is huge. The splits, the conflicts, the us and them, and that needs to be healed. And it needs to be healed by listening to both sides and understanding the stories and humanizing each other.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know a time which has been more angry than it is at the moment. Yeah. Certainly in my lifetime. I mean, there have been times, 1970s. I mean, when we were talking about when I stood against your father, I mean, that was a very rough time as well. But the anger wasn't quite like it is today. So, I mean, how have you actually, and how have you done it, got people who are on the far right together with other people, and what success have you had on that, and how have you gone about doing that?
Well, I'm working on it. I'm working with other people. I think the events that have happened in the last few months have really shown those of us that are working on countering violent extremism that we need to really get together and work. So there's some interesting projects and people that are reaching out to me, and I'm reaching out to them, and together we can create groups. But right now, that I haven't had much experience, though I do work with people who were involved in some far right groups, but are now working to stop others from joining them, and we can learn a lot from. We call them formers, the former, whatever group it is, but that have been through these movements and have come out the other side. And that's a really great way of understanding what would bring a young person to join these groups. But the worst thing we can do is to, just demonize them and just label them. We need to somehow even understand the hardest people. And I do that by separating someone from what they do. I don't think we are our actions, and so I would never call Patrick a bomber or a killer. He's the man who planted the bomb. I'll describe what he did, and that to me is really important. And of course it's much more than that. I changed the story with Patrick. He did plant the bomb, and he's also become my friend and worked with me around the world. So there's ways in which we look at people, which I think is really, really important. It's so easy just to label people and then just write them off, but actually they're all individuals, and we can describe their behavior. And that, I feel, gives them choice to change.
I really admire the work, and
thank you.
Yes, I think it is quite amazing. It is what I do for the prison. I'm just the third person. I haven't been. Yeah, I have been burgled. Someone came into my house when I was away, but it is nothing compared to someone took my dad away.
Oh, well, I can tell the work you're doing is, hugely important. So thank you for that.
Yeah, thanks.
I mean, you were saying as well earlier that people who have been through an extreme situation and have given it up and help other people not to do it is important. I mean, we did a wonderful webinar with a guy called Sheldon Thomas, who formed Gangs Line. It was in who were in gangs. Do you know him? He was in a gang.
Yeah, of him, yeah.
And he now goes around working with the police, working with local authorities, working with community groups to try and talk about how you get people out of gangs. Because, I mean, maybe you found this as well with the IRA and with any other people you work with, the far right, that one of the problems is that many of these people are often themselves quite disenfranchised in many ways, and the group that they form become their family. And somehow their family is no longer their family. The gang is their family. The paramilitary is their family. And somehow you're going in there trying to break up their family as well when you're trying to, bring them back into the mainstream. Do you find that is a situation that you've discovered?
I think it's hard. I'm actually just thinking, this might seem like an odd comparison, but I have friends who are part of Veterans for Peace, right? And there are men and women who went through the whole military experience and then felt disillusioned and decided to campaign to stop the military going into the schools to recruit children, and worked actively to say what it's actually like to be in Iraq or different places. They're doing incredible work, and actually one of the really hardest things is when they leave the military and join Veterans for Peace is actually, where do they belong, and who is now their family and support group. And that's why Veterans for Peace is there, because that can give them that structure, that support. But I think it can be very lonely when you've had a very great support structure with a sort of one kind of mindset, and then you leave. So people do need a lot of support when they do that, definitely.
We've got a comment coming from Gloria Hayes. She says, and I'll read it out because it's quite interesting. She says, "Thank you for sharing." She's the executive director of the Institute for Healing and Memories in North America. And she says their founder, Michael Lapsley, was targeted by the apartheid regime while exiled from South Africa. He lost his hands and eye and suffered severe burns. And now they do the very work that you're speaking of all over the world. And she was wondering if you knew him or have any contacts with his organization.
He's a dear friend. I actually met him, first of all, about 2003. I've seen him in different countries, in South Africa, in America, in Italy, in the UK, and I'm in touch with him on Facebook. And I often share his story, because what's interesting about his story, and he's the most inspiring person. I mean, the work he does is brilliant. It's exactly what I've been talking about. He brings together people from different beliefs, different backgrounds, and through a structured weekend of sharing their story, then healing happens and empathy grows. But what's interesting about him is that he very clearly says he doesn't forgive, and I like to give people different ideas about forgiveness, because I think it's a complex word. And I give him as an example as someone who's the most compassionate person doing incredible work, who says that he doesn't forgive. He doesn't know who sent the letter bomb, and it's his right to not forgive. Oh yeah, no, I love him to bits. How lovely you know him.
Have you done any work with the Forgiveness Project as well? We did a webinar with them some time ago, and they do quite a lot of work on reconciliation through forgiveness.
The Forgiveness Project, yes, I'm one of their first stories. And Marina Cantacuzino, who founded Forgiveness Project, she and I have facilitated workshops together in Rwanda, at Co in Switzerland last year. And yeah, the work they do is absolutely amazing. And it's really great to look at their stories. And I know a lot of the people, they are amazing. And a lot of them don't like to use the word forgiveness. So it's a hard word.
Yeah, it is a hard word, and I guess it turns some people off. And I suppose Father Michael is probably right in saying you can still go for reconciliation even if you find it in your heart difficult to forgive. Well, I mean, you talk about, Father Mike, you talk about Forgiveness Project. Are you sort of, or have you, the other people now built up a network of people doing the similar work to what you're doing, in trying to sort of create an accumulator effect to try and get that work out as widely as you possibly can to as many groups? Do you work together or do you work separately?
Work together, well, both. I work separately and together. There have been several networks I've been part of, and there have been conferences which have brought together formers and survivors, and we all have so much in common. And so yes, I have friends from around the world, and and it's a growing it's a growing network, definitely. And I know, every time we have these horrendous atrocities, there's always going to be, some people after that who will be wanting to do something positive, and will, I'll probably end up knowing them. I know, I know people from most of the atrocities that have happened, and it is unfortunately, it is a growing world.
Okay, I mean, the other thing that's really striking about you is not just the forgiveness and the reconciliation, but the resilience. I mean, you have developed a huge amount of personal resilience, and how important is that now? I mean, in the times we're living with the sort of things that are going on in America, the anger that's going on in this country, the whole issue with ISIS and the intercommunal conflicts of that kind. It's almost impossible sometimes to not give up hope, to sort of give in and say, I don't know what I can do about it. But how have you developed the resilience to realize that you must keep going on and that you do go on?
Well, for me, it's a choice. It's a choice. Do I wake up in the morning and decide to see the humanity in everyone, and work towards healing and transformation? And I for me, it's about baby steps and maybe bigger steps, and it's just knowing that I can do what I can and I can't do everything, and taking time out. I've got a lot better at looking after myself to have that balance. I wouldn't say I quite got the balance right yet, but that's what I'm learning. And to be able to have times just to breathe in and relax, and be in nature. This can be emotionally demanding work. So it's also really staying close to what I need and looking after those needs in me, because if I'm not meeting my needs, then I can't be doing this work. It's not going to be sustainable. So it's important that I find a way to balance. And so if I'm going to do something that's very intense emotionally, then I take time out for me. And I didn't know that at the beginning, so this is new. It probably seems quite like normal to most of you, but I'm a late learner in this. And so I've just read what Gloria said about Michael Lapsley, and I just want to make the point is, for me, I talk about him not forgiving because it's linked to meeting the person, and then he would forgive, but that doesn't stop him from being really compassionate. And I think sometimes we think that there's a pressure that we have to forgive to be a good person, and it's much more complicated than that. And actually, we can still do incredible work while not forgiving. For me, it's more important to give up revenge. It's giving up wanting to hurt another human being, and that need is really understandable. It's really understandable that we want to hurt someone. And that's where I think the choice is, if we have support, we can make that choice. But we can only come to that choice when we're ready. If someone said to me they just had the most terrible thing happen, I'm not going to say to them, well, you can choose to give up revenge. That would be really inappropriate. I would listen, and if they needed to come to that at that time, then they would. So it's not about telling people how they have to respond. It's about making sure people have the support, the right kind of support, so they can go through these experiences in the way that's right for them.
Yeah, I mean, Linda is saying that, I mean, she has problems in showing forgiveness when children are the victims of violence and terrorism of any kind. And sometimes it's important to shame and name rather than forgive. I mean, what do you say when you hear people say things like that? They have that feeling they want to shame the person who's done something. And does that help at all?
I think that shame has a part to play, that for someone who has inflicted hurt on other people, that shame is part of becoming accountable and owning up to what they've done. I think it's important to take responsibility when we hurt other people, and sometimes shame is part of that process, but there's also unhealthy shame. What worries me about I'll give you an example of the death penalty that we still have in different parts of the world and in America. You know, victims are told that if the person who, let's say, killed their children, that if the death penalty then kills them, they're going to suddenly feel better. They'll get closure, and that will be the end of their pain. And that's very misleading. You know, it might give them a moment of sweet revenge of like, yes, you know, I'm feeling better. But then a few days later, the pain will still be there, you know. And, you know, I don't think it's the healthiest way to meet someone's need is to go for revenge. It might give some temporary sense of relief. I mean, I can only speak for myself. You know, I remember when I was so angry with one of my daughter's boyfriends that I sent a really nasty text. I mean, it's a small example, but the moment I sent that text, all I wanted to do was hurt him and shame him. And it didn't take me long to start feeling the regret, you know. But that I couldn't stop myself sending it that day, so I have forgiven myself for it. But I remember, you know, that feeling of wanting to hurt and shame was just overwhelming. But then I had to deal with the fact that, you know, that I had hurt him as well, and so it didn't help. It's hard, you know. We live in a world where there is so much hurt, you know, and people doing dreadful things, and people need to be held accountable for what they do. You know, I'm not talking about forgiving everyone, letting them off, you know, and how do we make people accountable? You know, I believe in the restorative processes can really help with that.
Yeah, well, I think we've all been through that situation with our daughters, so I think I understand.
Hooray.
Yeah, I understand that you're not alone. But I mean, we're getting close to the end of the webinar now, and I know you have to go on very quickly. So let me ask you one final question. I mean, the world is in a terrible mess at the moment. I mean, there are so many problems, so much anger out there. Are you optimistic that with the right sort of attitudes, we can get through it? Do you still keep your optimism there, or do you ever get depressed at all and think, you know, it's not going to happen? Do you keep that resilience going? Do you think there's hope at the end of the tunnel?
I work on it, you know, I cultivate it. Yes, there are times when it just seems that there's no way out of the madness and the craziness and the pain, and you hear stories, and, you know, and then I remember people I've met, this young man I met recently, it took him 10 years to get from South Sudan somewhere safe, and he's now studying law in Switzerland. And he shared me with a story. He came to my workshop, and I looked into his eyes, and he's just embodies compassion. There's no bitterness there, you know, and for the sake of him, that helps me. And there are many people I meet all the time, and I do have hope. And I think almost having hope, active hope, is a form of non-violence, is actually a way of creating a different world, and we need to believe it's possible, and to know that there's more of us who are choosing love and compassion and empathy and working in difficult areas. I know so many young people who are working with refugees, who are working in some of the most difficult areas, who are trying to change their communities, who are going to universities to study things that will help them to change the world, to be positive change makers. You know, they are the hope. They are doing it. That generation are incredible. And, you know, one day the change on the grassroots is going to be on the political level, and the people in making decisions for us are going to be those who are choosing what we all believe in, you know, in friendship, in love, in working for solutions that meet everyone's needs. And, you know, that's the world that I'm working towards.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Joe. That was a most amazing story. And I think, you know, people will hear it for the first time, and indeed hear it many times. And I've heard it now 2 or 3 times. You can't fail but to be amazed at the journey you've been through, and the outcome that's happened as a result of you coming together and working in the way you do. So, you know, thank you for doing this. Thank you for telling people, because I think you've helped a lot of people. And this, we've recorded this, and we'll turn this into a video. I'll probably turn your presentation also into an audio podcast, because I think that's good, you know, in its own right as well, and we'll disseminate that out to a lot of people. So, you know, that's really, really great. And also, Joe, if you've got any links you want to send me, like your website, Linda asked you about the film you mentioned and whether that's available. If you've got any links you want to send me, I will make sure that goes out to people as well, so that they can make contact with you. And if they want to be involved in anything you're doing, help in any way, then they've got your contact details. So if you do that, that'd be great. I put a link up at the bottom to our own membership site, because we do encourage people to join up to Global Net 21, just to help us do what we do, because we do so many of these things that, you know, we now do about 75 events a year and lots of webinars, and so it's quite a lot of work. So if you can join and help us, if you're not a member already, I'd really, really appreciate it. But also, more importantly, to join groups like Joe's, because the work she's doing, you know, is really on the ground work, which has a lot of impact and a lot of effect. So thank you, Joe, for doing this.